Well, welcome back, all. Welcome back. Thanks to all of you who have joined us for the morning's conversations, and in particular, our tremendous lunch discussion with Chief Justice Leo Strine and President Richard Trumka of the AFL-CIO. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And we're turning now to an even more difficult subject, the subject of corporate resilience, in a panel that will be led by Lydia DePillis of ProPublica. The subject of this panel, as I say, is corporate resilience. And to frame that conversation, I want to offer the following question. Despite a decade of economic growth, many corporations, as well as the economy at large, found itself unprepared for the COVID-19 crisis. How do we change that going forward? It's a broad and difficult question, and for that reason, we've put together a panel of broad perspectives from the private sector to finance to public policy. So with that said, Lydia, thank you again for being here and for helping us convene this discussion. We look forward to it. Take it away.
Thank you, Rob, for bringing such a great panel together. I'm excited for this. I'm Lydia. I work for ProPublica. We're a nonprofit news organization where I cover economic policy. And the folks we have joining us today are, there's a lot of depth and experience. And so I'll just run through some bios really quick. Bharat Ramamurthy is a member of the Congressional Oversight Commission for the CARES Act. And before that, he worked for Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, on banking and economic policy. Antonia Weiss is a senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. And before that, was a senior counselor at the Treasury Department during the Obama administration. Sala Omarova is a professor at Cornell Law School, where she focuses on banking, finance, and corporate governance. And Scott Kapoor is a managing partner at Andreessen Horowitz, where he has invested in some of the most valuable companies to have come out of Silicon Valley in the last decade. So, this is the post-lunch panel where, like, in normal times, everybody would be like kind of sleepy and probably skip it. But so I'm glad you're all here. And it's a really broad topic that we've been given, this idea of corporate resilience in the time of COVID. So we kind of wanted to define it. There's many ways you could define it. And so that's going to be part of our project to kind of determine what should be the goals of a corporation and what we should support through public policy in a time of crisis like this. So the first kind of question I wanted to throw out there is, as a threshold matter, like, how did corporations do as COVID forced this economic shutdown? Like, should they have been more resilient? Should they have been able to carry on longer without laying people off? Or did they perform okay, considering that this was not something that most of us really anticipated? It's a kind of shock that we've never really seen before. You know, so does anyone want to take that on to start out?
Sure, I'd be happy to start if you're okay. So this is Scott, by the way. Thank you for having me. Look, I think in total, I would say I think the system functioned reasonably well from the perspective of the corporation. I think we got to separate out the perspective of the corporation from the perspective of potentially the employees. From the perspective of the corporation, I think essentially, you know, the government did most of what I think we would have wanted it to do, which is certainly, you know, we can argue about obviously the extent of the Fed's engagement otherwise, but I think the Fed tried to take a position that, look, their primary objective here is to make sure that we have, you know, capital markets and particularly, you know, kind of credit markets functioning properly so that corporations can actually roll over things like commercial paper and other stuff like that. And I think that was beneficial. I think the government did a good job in terms of trying to get assets into the hands of individuals for consumption purposes. So, you know, the initial, you know, $600, $1,200 payments. Again, I think there's a lot to discuss and we can argue about the efficiency of the mechanism by which they did that, but the idea of trying to kind of tide people over from a consumption perspective, I think was generally good. And so if you look at least at, you know, the corporate side of things, I think, you know, for the most part, most of the corporations have been able to find ways to kind of get through this. I think if we look at it certainly from the employee perspective, you know, there's a lot bigger open questions, which is number one, if you look at things, for example, like PPP that the government did, I think the government probably anticipated that this would be a much shorter time frame required to be able to tide these businesses over. And so things like the forgiveness of loans being tied to relatively short-term retention of employees, probably in retrospect was, an idea that just didn't quite play out well, just given the longevity of this. And then if we look more generally, I think at kind of what will employment opportunities look like for people, when we come out of this, we've certainly accelerated a trend, I believe, in terms of technology being a much bigger player in the market. And so I think there's a reasonable case to be made that the companies and the government itself certainly could be more actively involved in how we think about retraining and kind of imagining what the workforce should look like over the next 30, 40, 50 years, and thinking about kind of ways in which we could support activities in that light as well.
Yeah, that covers a lot of ground. Does anyone else want to offer some thoughts on that?
Well, just to pick up on, it's Antonio, just to pick up on what Scott said, businesses largely did what they were capable of. Large businesses tapped credit, small businesses, many of them went out of business. 1 of 5 small businesses expect to go out of business in the next 6 months, and they employ 50% of the workforce. I think the government response was initially meant to bridge the economy from one end of COVID to the other end. It was of uncertain duration. And the government did that by providing direct financial support to individuals in the form of enhanced unemployment direct payments, and in general, credit to businesses. And the missing link in all of this, going back to the definition of corporate resiliency, was employment. There was very little done to assure maintenance of employment in business. The 2 modest steps were forgivability of PPP loans under certain circumstances, which is yet to be tested, and sort of a wish by legislators that credit should only be extended to businesses that, by the Federal Reserve and Treasury, that maintain employment. But this was a wish that was not translated into reality. And the consequence of this is that US peak unemployment was anywhere from 15 to 20% in March during the shutdown. And that was more than twice as much as our OECD partners, all of whom were 3, 6, 7% unemployment and who are at lower levels than we are today. And really the experiment, going back to what Scott said, which the United States undertook, is can we take 20 million workers, put them on the unemployment rolls, which were creaky at best, and then expect for them to be reabsorbed by the economy when demand resumes. And what we didn't do, which all of our OECD partners did do, is institute some form of wage support, which is to say payments to workers as opposed to individuals so that they could stay in their jobs. And that's something that was done in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the UK, New Zealand, all over the world. And as a result, we have this sort of experiment as to whether all of these workers who have been shut off from their link to their starting jobs are going to be rehired by their initial employers or going to find their way to new employment. And it's really an experiment that's never been tried at that level. So, I mean, I've written about wage support. Now I'll pass over to someone else with Jared Bernstein and Mark Zandi. And its benefit really would have been that it would have been good for workers because it would have kept them in their jobs, would have been good for business because it would have left the workforce intact and made them more creditworthy. And it would have been good for the economy just because of the demand effects. And lastly, it had a level of bipartisan support. So I think this was the big missing link, and you see it in the way in which businesses responded.
Yeah, just to build on what Antonio was saying, I think there's really 2 major lessons that I take from the crisis and the response so far. So the first is that we now have a very strong body of evidence that in good times, corporations will take care of their shareholders and their executives first, and the workers at those corporations will be the last to benefit. After a very extended period of rising corporate profits and economic growth, we were just starting to see some real wage increases going into the pandemic, and of course that was immediately reversed once we hit the pandemic. And once the pandemic hit, the corporations responded by asking their workers to shoulder the burden first before shareholders and executives took on any of that, right? That's how we end up in a situation like just the other day. I saw, Disney's laying off 26,000 employees, and at the same time, executive compensation is back to normal levels, 2019 levels, right? Shareholder payouts continue to go forward even as workers are laid off and furloughed. And so I think that there's really two lessons from that, right? First is, if you want to help workers, by you meaning Congress, the federal government, you got to help workers directly, right? The idea that if you give support to companies that will translate into help for their employees is not a link that really exists very strongly. At a minimum, you're going to lose a lot in the process, and a lot of that money is going to get siphoned off into other areas, right? Even the PPP, which had some provisions in it to make sure that the money went to help support workers, the best study that I've seen found that it was cost about $200,000 per job saved, and that's not a very good. That's very expensive compared to just providing support directly to working people. The second thing I think we have to take from the crisis is that we need to change fundamentally the way that corporations operate in the United States. Like this idea that in good times, everyone but workers are going to benefit first, and then in bad times, immediately workers are going to be the first to get hit. That's just not sustainable. And I think what we need to do is figure out what series of changes are necessary in order to link up again corporate profits and workers' wages and benefits. Right, this link was severed back in the 80s. And we've seen an extended period of rising corporate profits and stagnant worker wages. And I think one of the main things that I think Congress should be focused on in the months and the years ahead is figuring out how do we reestablish that link and make sure that when your company does well, you as the worker does well. And I think that there's a number of changes we can make to the way corporations operate and the rules under which they operate in order to reestablish that link.
We'll get to that. Dr. Omarova, did you want to weigh in at all?
Yeah, thank you. This is really a fascinating discussion right away, and it's great to hear Scott's and Antonio's and Bharat's perspective on it. And I agree with pretty much all of that's been said, but I want to also sort of emphasize the fact that all of these changes that we need to put in place, thinking about how corporations conduct their business under normal circumstances, how they treat the employees, how they understand the importance of maintaining general demand in the economy for their own individual profits. All of that sort of typically kicks in only in the moment of crisis, right? But building resilience, even corporate resilience, is an ongoing process. If you don't prepare for it, right, then in the moment of crisis, you're just basically stuck with some minimal solutions. And so what that means is that we have to talk about the structural capacity of our government and our corporations to work together and to reshape the nature, the structure of the national economy in some sense, right? In a way that would empower all of us to kick in during the crisis and preserve the domestic supply chains, the domestic employment, and to change the structure of the economic relations. So to me, the government capacity in that moment became that sort of the weak link. Like, to me, what I saw was that our government just basically had to use the tools it always used, put more credit, more loans right there, working through capital markets. But the reality is, this was such an unusual crisis that demand is never going to come back, or whatever, the lost production is never going to come back. What will happen when there is a wave of bankruptcies of companies that now are saddled with the debt that they cannot repay, for example? What will happen in that situation? So I think that thinking forward, we need to think about sort of how the federal government should kind of figure out the institutional platform and the range of tools that it can put into action during a crisis, not through just lending under certain conditions, but also perhaps by taking more proactive role in equity capital investments, and actually start getting deeper into the allocative activities in the economy rather than just being an outsider to it.
Right, and you've written about a National Investment Authority, which is a super interesting idea, and want to come back to that soon. But also, wanted to take a minute to look backwards for a second, because this crisis was very unique in some ways, but also we had one just 10 years ago, and that was a shock to employment. And it was obviously a financial sector problem. And so the remedies to that didn't really apply to a global health pandemic. But I'm wondering, from a overall financial stability standpoint, how did the reforms that enacted in the wake of the great financial crisis hold up, right? Were we better off this time around after that happened, or were there big missed opportunities that were exposed when this all hit earlier this year?
Is this a question for?
It could be for anyone. Like, I'd be curious for Antonio's perspective, actually, just having worked in Treasury and having had to implement a lot of this stuff. Like, do you think that whether it's Dodd-Frank reforms or some of the systemic financial risk oversight pieces of it, did those not even have a chance to go into action because this was such a weird episode, or did they help in ways?
It's a complicated question to answer, but I would say the most general point is this is the most unequal financial or recession that the country's been through in recent history. And as unequal as the financial crisis was in 08 and 09, I mean, it pales in comparison to the inequities of today's recovery. And I don't think anybody on this conference needs to be reminded of the statistics around how those who've been laid off or in disadvantaged communities have fared compared to technology companies and the like. And so they have long-running political, economic ramifications as a result. The basic question is that, yeah, we averted a financial crisis so far, and that the safeguards that were put in place in Dodd-Frank largely allowed the country to avert an economic and healthcare crisis from also becoming a financial crisis. The weakness in this, and I don't want to divert us too much from the main topic, is that the non-banking sector has really enriched itself. The banking sector to a degree, but the non-banking hedge fund and other sector has enriched itself to a degree that I think the general public has yet to fully comprehend. And there was legislation in Dodd-Frank to prevent the non-banking sector from spilling over into financial stability risks. And it began to do so in March. And when the Fed stepped in, as it had to prop up markets, it also propped up all of those non-banks. So I think that the ramifications of the inequity of the distributional effect of the healthcare crisis, the economic crisis, when it's fully met with an understanding of what the financial market benefits were, I think that we're going to have a lot to analyze, not just in the coming period, but for decades.
Antonio, do you think, I'm curious your views, do you think the difference in the equity is somewhat a function of the kind of that the current thing we're dealing with obviously is largely from an economic perspective, a consumption crisis? Obviously, I don't want to minimize the health crisis, but it's largely consumption based as opposed to credit based in the 08-09 time period. Do you think that has contributed to the inequity, or do you think it's just a deeper situation of kind of this divide between kind of technology-based businesses versus kind of more traditional industry, being impacted by the current crisis?
I'd like to let others answer as well, but I mean, the healthcare inequities are staggering in terms of access to basic healthcare, who's suffered the greatest consequences from COVID, mortality and the like. The lack of savings for those who've been laid off. The incidence of this pandemic and the economic crisis have fallen disproportionately on the poor and the moderate income. And at the same time, a number of people have done extraordinarily well. And, some of that has to do with some of the structural economy issues Bharat was talking about before, which are longstanding and really do date back to the 1980s. And some of it has to do with the policy response, my judgment.
Yeah, I would just add one thing to that, which is, we certainly averted a financial crisis, and a financial crisis isn't good, right? And it would have had a negative effect on the economy and on a lot of the folks that we've all discussed and that we're concerned about. I think what we've learned, though, is that the Fed provides an incredible safety net for certain parts of the economy. And we're able to, it's a more generous and robust and quicker moving safety net than what we can provide to people who don't operate in the financial system. And that's not a reason not to use that safety net. I think we should, but we have to understand that the effects on inequality of using that safety net are severe. The Fed operates through the capital markets. Their way of providing support to the system is essentially to provide a lot of liquidity to the financial system, which then filters its way through the rest of the economy in a positive way. But the folks in the financial system benefit first and most quickly. And so I think the lesson to learn is, number one, we need to make our safety net much more robust for people who are not intricately involved in the financial system. And number two, when we do have to use these safety nets that operate primarily through the financial system, we need to take steps afterwards to address the inequities that creates, right? Whether it's through tax policy, on the back end, whether it's through putting in place rules on the front end that make financial system even more, robust and less in need of the kinds of support that the Fed provides. I think some people will criticize will point out these issues with the Fed's response and then say that's the reason that the Fed shouldn't have responded. I'm not part of that. I think that it was important that the Fed respond as they did, but I think it's important to then take the next step and recognize the sort of distributional effects of the Fed responding as it did and take steps to correct that in the future.
So the Fed's response, obviously, probably many of the people on this call or watching know, was immediate, thorough, exactly what its particular constituents needed at that time. And then when pressed to try to help out parts of the economy that it hasn't been used to helping out directly through the Main Street Lending Program in particular, and also through corporate bond purchases, they've been not drawn down very much at all. The Fed argues that the corporate bond purchases had this tremendous effect on lending and interest rates and allowed people to borrow even if it wasn't the Fed buying their debt directly. But anyway, so the Main Street program has made very few loans. And so the question is was that a fool's errand? Should that capability have been taken up by the Treasury directly, and that equity money, $75 billion worth of it in the Main Street program, just injected directly? Or is there some hope that a lending program backed by the Fed could be the right thing for companies in need of capital right now?
I'm happy to just start quickly, but I know Solly, for example, has thought and written a lot about this. I think that it's not that sophisticated to say, grants are better than loans for companies and state and local governments that are in need. But I think that's basically the bottom line here, which is the reason that there hasn't been a lot of take up on the Main Street program and also on the municipal liquidity facility for state and local governments is that, number one, they're loans, which means that they have to be repaid. And a lot of struggling businesses and state and local governments aren't in a position where they can take on more debt. In the case of state and local governments, some of that is actually by law. But the second point is that in both of these facilities, the Fed has made the terms of the loans much more onerous than they have to. Because, for example, the municipal liquidity facility, it offers a maximum repayment term of 3 years, right? And it requires state and local governments to pay a penalty rate relative to normal times. And as a result, you've only had 2 entities in the entire country use this over the last several months. If you extend that repayment term to 10 years, if you drop the interest rate that they charge, then I could see quite a few state and local governments taking advantage of it. And just to make one final point here, the Fed made a big splash recently, I'm sure you all saw, with their new statement on monetary policy, right? That monetary policy, that full employment should be a broad-based and inclusive goal. And it was, in essence, a recognition that that the unemployment rate for Black and Hispanic individuals has tended to be much higher than for white individuals, and that when they start to raise rates, when the unemployment rate overall gets to a certain level, they are leaving behind those Black and Hispanic communities. You know, the Fed has a tool right now available to it that would really help address Black unemployment in particular. You know, state and local governments employ a disproportionate number of Black workers. And so by providing more generous loans to state and local governments, you could really avert and reverse some of the bad trends that we're seeing in the Black unemployment rate, which right now is about 6 percentage points higher than the white unemployment rate. So, you know, for me, the Fed has an opportunity right after releasing this statement to put its words into action and to take steps to provide more inclusive monetary policy. And to me, it's disappointing that they haven't done that.
Mm-hmm. Tala, did you have thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are, as always, kind of a more general nature. To me, the way the federal government's crisis response was shaped in this particular situation really does expose all of those institutional dysfunctions that we've had for decades, and now we're kind of seeing them. The fact that the Fed did what it's done and didn't do any more goes back to the Fed's fear constantly of being accused of picking winners and losers, right? And sort of this whole issue of walking some kind of an artificial line between monetary policy, which is effectively affecting the price of money rentals in the economy on the one hand, and fiscal policy, which is supposed to be the Treasury's job. This is sort of a politicized and kind of hardened divide. In the time of crisis, we cannot live by those rules, right? And yet we don't have the institutions who would be able to come in and actually do what needs to be done. And going back a little bit to this Dodd-Frank Act question, right? I'm a big supporter of all the reforms that were put in place to preserve and increase the robustness of the financial system alone. But the biggest gap in that reform was that we kept looking at the financial system in isolation, as if we get correctly the rules of risk and leverage that the financial institutions carry on, then somehow by some kind of wisdom of what they do, they will channel capital, channel credit, channel equity investments into precisely those pockets of the economy where that capital is needed most. But now we see that that doesn't happen. There are a lot of reasons why. It's not because corporations are inherently bad or somehow morally deficient. It is a structural issue of incentives and behavior. And I think those are the issues we're seeing today as well with respect how the crisis has been handled.
Yeah. So Scott, do you see that from where you sit?
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, I was going to ask the question maybe as a follow-up to that for Saleh is what would be a solution to that? So is there a theory that you would have kind of the moral equivalent of kind of reserve requirements applied to a broader cross-section of private companies as a way to deal with kind of that issue that, maybe the answer is, look, just like we've enhanced reserve requirements for banks, that you need to have essentially some similar component of reserve requirements in the non-bank commercial world. Is that one way that you would deal with that issue?
Well, that's actually an interesting suggestion. I haven't really thought about
I don't know if it's a good suggestion. I'm just trying to think about it.
Yeah. So my thinking is generally that I think we need to kind of we need basically to change the mindset about how we think about the role of the federal government, for example, vis-a-vis the role of private business in shaping the structure of the national economy. And I think it requires a change on both sides. I think on the corporate side, the corporations need to kind of shift their thinking that corporate success is not just like an individual winner-take-all race, right? It's a team sport. And in a team sport, we will win, we will lose under certain circumstances. And every team requires a captain. And sort of the federal government should step into that role, become the captain in terms of allocation of resources, not just modulating the amount of the quantity of money that's sloshing around in the economic system. And I think what the government needs to do is that it needs to kind of step into the private markets operations, right? And help to address those various problems, the recurrent dysfunctions, with respect to aligning the incentives of individual corporations with the interests of the public in having a more resilient and more structurally balanced, equitable economy, because those interests are not necessarily seen from within the corporate boardroom. And that's why, one of my proposals that, Bharat brought about actually was originally advanced with my colleague at Cornell, Bob Hockett, was to create a new, call it developmental policy institution or industrial policy institution, something that sits between the Fed and the Treasury and deals specifically with the allocational matters, but works with the market. So that's where I would go, but I would certainly be interested in hearing more about those kinds of additional.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up, and obviously Antonio and Bharat, you mentioned this a little bit, it seems to me listening to the panel, there's two kind of fundamental structural problems, at least that this crisis illustrates, and even the previous crisis, which is, one is, we're just not very good at crisis planning, right? Everything effectively, at least today, so far, everything has been a black swan event, at least from a planning and probabilistic planning perspective. And so, we're just not very good about contemplating these things, proactively as opposed to retroactively. And it seems like the other big issue then is, and the Fed highlights this, is the best way to get consumptive dollars into, individuals, obviously in most cases requires going through Congress as opposed to the Fed, which means now we subject all those things to the normal political challenges, of course, that we have in, obviously divided government. And so, I don't know if you guys would agree with that or not, but it seems to me like finding some way structurally, whether through what Saleh's saying is, do you need another organization or somebody else? There's got to be some other mechanism that potentially addresses those at least fundamental challenges, because otherwise you're stuck with consumptive related activity always effectively has to deal with the congressional challenges. But maybe you guys think differently. You've seen this much more than I.
Just one quick point on that is, if you put workers in a position to have more control over corporate behavior, then some of that starts to happen naturally, right? If you look at Germany, where workers elect at larger companies, workers elect 50% of the board, and you look at how Germany responds to these types of crises, both this time around and in 2008, some of that that happens naturally, right? Because the workers through their representatives on the board are able to negotiate a corporate reaction to that crisis that it basically ends up protecting a lot of their consumption, right? In other words, in Germany, there's a lot fewer layoffs. Instead, workers tend to negotiate for a short-term reduction in their income rather than getting laid off, right? And so I think to me, it keeps coming back to the point, if we fundamentally change the way that corporations conduct themselves in both good times and bad, by sort of swinging this pendulum, which has swung so far in the direction of all that matters is the short-term interests of the shareholders, and back towards, the corporation is a public entity at the end of the day, and one that should have obligations to the community it operates in and the people that it employs. And we should make structural changes to make corporations act in that manner. I think you end up solving a lot of the problems without requiring sort of a larger government role. Now, that said, I think something like what Saleh has talked about is a good idea in terms of a national investment authority and so on. But by changing the way that corporations make decisions, you can effectively change the way that trillions of dollars flow through the economy, right? Without a new spending program and without a new tax. And I think that's why that set of reforms holds out so much promise.
If you want to see that set of reforms embodied, just go check out Liz Warren's Accountable Capitalism Act, which has many of them written down. But so, I mean, a question here on how, Bharat, especially, you're defining resilience, right? Because in this crisis, we really don't know what it's going to look like at the end. And my fear is that, I mean, I guess this is a counterfactual anyway, but if we were to have optimized for keeping everybody attached to their jobs, it could end up in a situation where companies don't have the freedom to figure out what their business model even looks like at the end of this. And so should stimulus programs really have provisions that require companies to keep their employees, or is that actually slowing down the kind of change that may need to happen? And the better idea would be to support people directly so that even if they don't have a job, they can take care of what they need to take care of, and then they can have the freedom to choose what seems to make sense for them in the like post-pandemic world.
Yeah, I think that, oh, sorry, go ahead, Antonio.
I mean, I would just say, I think that we left out workers in our response to the crisis. And what needs to happen now is direct stimulus that brings workers back to their jobs, one aspect of it. We need to rethink many of the issues that were being discussed. One is that, you know, we have weakened worker protections systematically over the last 30 years, both in terms of worker safety and worker benefits and pay. Those all need to be strengthened. We've weakened worker bargaining rights legislatively. It's in the Supreme Court systematically since the 80s. Those need to be revisited. And when we are trying to bridge an economy back to what it may have been, we need to recognize that if all we do is to detach individuals from their companies with the existing individual worker protections, we haven't accomplished very much. And so this ought to provoke a rethink. I want to say that it's urgent, though, in the sense that there are decisions being made right now about layoffs. And to come back to what Bharat said, workers are nowhere in that decision making. So all of the companies which have taken on more debt, and recall that the Federal Reserve was concerned about corporate indebtedness prior to COVID, leverage is up in the non-financial sector substantially post-COVID. The rating agencies, which determine whether or not a company's investment grade, which is the Federal Reserve bright line, or junk, non-investment grade, are really looking through the crisis to 2021 and 2022 when they assess the creditworthiness of businesses. But companies themselves are undertaking something which banks did after the financial crisis, stress tests. And they're saying, well, what if we have an L-shaped recovery or a different shaped recovery than what's anticipated in markets? And the people who ran the table for that discussion are the board and management. Just outside the room are the shareholders and the rating agencies. And there's really no one who, by legal mandate, represents workers in that discussion. And so not only have we been through this initial shock to the workforce in COVID, but we have this pending risk that's been shifted onto workers, which is that companies that are now over leveraged are going to look to cut costs if their ratings are at risk. And if the economy doesn't come back stronger, if we're in this slog, we could expect a fairly protracted set of announcements having to do with additional layoffs, simply because that's where businesses go when they need to reduce leverage.
Yeah. So I want to switch gears briefly to the question of corporate consolidation, which was a concern before the pandemic to varying degrees in various audiences. But it seems pretty clear that a crisis of this magnitude is going to cause the bigger, as Antonio started out with, the biggest and most successful companies, particularly in the tech sector, gobbling up all of those who don't have the dry powder to make it through this kind of demand contraction. So how worried should we be about that? And does that have stability ramifications, or is it actually maybe better to have a collection of big companies that have the ability to weather this kind of downturn? Is that maybe more stable, especially if there are the kinds of guardrails and rebalancing of worker power that would make them into useful institutions from an equity standpoint as well, right? Like there are unions that really like big companies because they can bargain with them all at once. CWA and AT&T is one example. There is a way in which we could set that up so that big companies wouldn't be as much of a problem. So corporate consolidation, good or bad, it's gonna happen. Should we try to stave it off?
I'll take a stab at it. I think it depends. It depends on who's doing the consolidation and what the implications are. So let me just give a couple examples. I think that, look, if we have fundamental questions about anti-competitive behavior or things of that sort that are, already, should be covered obviously under our existing, things like antitrust laws, then, assuming those are valid, then obviously consolidation in many respects probably has a greater likelihood for, consumer harm than in the absence of it. On the other side, though, I think that to your point about, workers and employment, part of the way to potentially think about this pandemic is we have accelerated a trend that was already happening, which is the prevalence of technology in our, in our world, and the future of and really redefining what the future of employment may look like, not just for full-time workers, but also, as we all know, there's lots of discussions around people like gig workers and other stuff who are, kind of a new classification that, we hadn't considered before. And so, on the positive side, if consolidation essentially, allows employees to be brought into, kind of the 21st century and beyond in terms of what the skill sets are required and provides a whole new set of jobs, it's not obvious to me that necessarily propping up companies that really may not have viable business prospects going forward in a much more technologically driven economy is really doing, much of a service to employees in that, in those industries as well.
I just have to say that, half of all employment is with small business that really doesn't benefit from any of the technological advantages that you're describing to a meaningful degree. It does in certain respects, but not. And the survival of those businesses is first and foremost going to be important to employment. But second, going back to the question about our response to the financial crisis and Dodd-Frank, if this crisis doesn't give rise to a whole set of legislative initiatives around employment, the maintenance of employment, some of the issues we've discussed around worker pay, worker protections, worker bargaining power, if it doesn't give rise to that set of discussions and that kind of legislative initiative, the economy will pay a big price for it for really decades to come. And so technology is an advance for 3-4% of workers. There's no space in that to accommodate the mass unemployment and furloughing that's currently in place.
I'm curious what you guys think about the political economy of this, right? Because there, just lessons again from the last crisis, there were massive lobbying powers brought to bear on stopping a more concerted effort to regulate the financial sector. And so it happened, but it maybe didn't go far enough. It's one argument. And so do you anticipate that companies would fight the kinds of reforms, initiatives, ways of increasing worker power that we're talking about? Or are there arguments that could be made to say, to bring some on board or to work with folks? I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessary, right? Like elections have consequences, political power can be exerted. But, what's the argument to big companies and their investors that this actually needs to happen for the survival of the economy for the long term?
Well, I guess I could just quickly on that point. I mean, look, I think is further consolidation bad? I think the answer is unequivocally yes. You look at the data, small business formation, new business formation rates have been going down steadily over the last several years and are now at historic lows. It's really hard to start a small business in America right now, and what we're seeing is a sort of less dynamic and less innovative economy as there's more consolidation across different markets. And my concern would be that, while obviously there are tools in place to make sure that, or in theory, to guard against anti-competitive behavior, that's an uphill battle right now, especially the way that those laws have been defined and interpreted by the courts. And I think it's smarter for Congress, if they're concerned about this, to do something on the front end to prevent further consolidation. I mean, I think a related problem is that the private equity industry right now is sitting on tons of money that is just waiting to scoop up more in housing and in healthcare and nursing homes and so on. And their track record of how they've run those companies is pretty dire when it comes to how customers and workers are treated. or residents in the case of housing. So I think we're on the, what I think of COVID as sort of an acceleration of a lot of the trends that we've already started seeing pre-COVID, whether it's working from home, whether it's consolidation in industries, whether it's the growing role of private equity in a lot of different markets. All of those trends I think are going to be accelerated post-COVID, and I think the one that concerns me the most is consolidation. And I would just make a quick point, which is that while bargaining with bigger firms might be easier, I think the solution is not we should have bigger firms. I think the solution is that we should have something like sectoral bargaining, which allows employees of across the fast food industry or across specific industries to bargain together with a broad set of employers, which I think solves that same type of problem.
Yeah. You mentioned distributed workforce and working from home, Bharat, and that does seem like a mega trend that has been accelerated. And I am actually not sure what implications it has for. I mean, it impacts so many different companies in different ways, right? So, are there safety nets that we need to think about for companies that may just simply no longer be viable, right? If they're like downtown delis or the kinds of companies that thrive on density of both people and capital. I think about New York City and how its incredible tax base allows it to, create urban amenities and for businesses like little restaurants to thrive there. Do the particularities of this crisis demand the kinds of specific bailout programs right now, for example, that are being discussed right now on Capitol Hill for restaurants and large entertainment venues and such? Like, how do we have to think about those particular sectors that are hit in this very particular and unique way?
Well, our response to that right now is PPP, and PPP is wholly inadequate. PPP is poorly targeted to those businesses. It is slow. It runs through banks. Most of those businesses don't have banking relationships. And I think that when the full history is written on PPP, it'll find lots of tales of unjust enrichment as well. And there's some coming out already. So what we would have needed and what we still need is a much more aggressive sort of emergency disaster relief grant program to try to keep some of those businesses functioning. And I'd go back to an initial comment, which is that I don't think it's a time for hazarding what the future structure of work is going to be. I think it's a time for trying to protect the structure of work as we had it. And and to not try to forecast whether or not the small business on Main Street will be necessary in 10 years, but rather to try to find it a near-term future. And so we have problems on a scale that's never been experienced in terms of small business failure, unemployment in this country. And the first step ought to be to return to some semblance of what we had in place in March.
Well, if I may very quickly, I agree with Antonio and Bharat on that, but I also want to emphasize that sometimes, especially in times of big crises like we're experiencing today, the best way of addressing even the immediate problem is to have a longer term vision. And maybe the federal government really needs to kind of ramp up the stimulus investment in rebuilding the sort of public social infrastructure, shifting to a clean economy, do a little bit more planning with respect to what kind of economy, what kind of jobs we want to have in the future. This is the time to do it. We can't just sort of think about how we get back to where we were 9 months ago.
I totally agree with that.
I think we're at the end of our panel. This was super interesting. Thank you all. And I'll hand it back to Rob.
Thanks so much, Lydia. And thanks to all our panelists for these very insightful set of conversations about not only what we'll do in the near term, but what we have to do in the long term to address some of the structural issues exposed by the crisis. So thanks to all of you for joining us for this conversation. We're going to take a 10-minute break, let people get a cup of coffee, and we'll be back at 2 p.m. Eastern, where we're going to tackle an issue that all of our panelists have mentioned over the last few minutes, what to do about the crisis American small businesses are now facing. In particular, the best way to preserve and revive American small businesses during the recovery of this crisis and beyond. We'll resume that discussion at 2 p.m. Thanks again to our panelists. See everybody at 2.